listen in, ding-a-ling-a-lo, to our radio show, Financial Forte, Financial Forte.
Sandra and myself were purring with pleasure there. So this is Mr. Paul, and I'm joined today, as always, by Mr. Sandro Forte.
Buongiorno, Paul.
Buongiorno.
Or Paolo, I should say.
Paolo Maldini.
Do you know what? I always look forward to these moments with you. Because like I said last time, I just don't know what's going to happen next.
As the actress said to the bishop.
Indeed.
So, are you well?
I am well, actually. I have to say the burst of nice weather makes a change, so that's good. But otherwise, yeah, very busy travelling the country as I've done for 31 years. No relenting on that side of things. Everything's good. Yeah, very good, Paul. Thanks, you.
So for those of you who pay attention, we of course missed the Financial Forte show in June because Emma had COVID.
Indeed.
Yeah. So why do you think she got that so bad? You know, man. You know what I'm saying?
I don't know. I'm not quite sure. I mean, why does anybody get any? I mean, some of these things, there's no rhyme or reason. I know loads of people have had it 4 times. I know some people that haven't had it at all.
Me, yes. And you?
Yeah, and me.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. There's no explanation. I guess if there was...
Tough people, yes.
I guess if there was an explanation, we wouldn't be dealing with this particular crisis, would we? So I don't know, Paul's the answer, but she was very poorly.
So we are here for the July edition of Financial Forte with Paul Waite and Sandro Forte. And today we're going to talk about some really boring things, aren't we?
every month we talk about something that's boring. I mean,
so I'm going to try to be non-boring and spice it up. And Sandro's going to be sat there looking at me like, what are you on about? And of course he's got an advantage on me because you've just been to Ollie's.
I have been.
Sorry, what did you say? What did you say you were eating?
I had egg, bacon, sausage, beans, which is very unlike me, by the way. This is a departure from my normal breakfast. Egg, bacon, sausage, beans. The bread I left, and a cup of black coffee. It was very nice. I have to say they do a fine job.
They
down
do.
The Bridgewater Road.
Yes. So today we're going to be talking about things like SASs, pensions, special sort of owner-managed pensions. Let's call it that, shall we?
Well, on the basis that we dealt with a very dry subject last time, and that was pensions as a general subject matter, we did have a number of requests actually from listeners saying, tell us more about that, and in particular, as an owner-managed business person, I'd like to know how I can take better control of my pension arrangements. And then we start talking about SASs, self-administered pension schemes, and SIP, self-invested personal pensions, and then people get their knickers in a twist and say, I have no idea what you're talking about, can you explain it? So that's why we're here today.
Wow. Where do we start?
I don't know. Shall we let's try and make the complex simple, shall we? Shall we start with self-invested personal pensions? And there are, Paul, a couple of other things we're going to talk about today, if it's okay, if we've got time. One is a lot of people come to us saying, you know, what should I do about my mortgage at the moment? Because obviously interest rates are rising, everyone's aware of that. And do I fix my rate? Do I not fix my rate? And then the other thing that people talk to us a lot about is the current state of the markets. Do I invest? Do I withdraw my investments? How do I invest? Where do I go? How do I make sense of it all? So we'll try and throw something along those lines in as well.
So just as a bit of a recap, so one of my great worries about the world at the moment is that people are massively underfunded pension-wise, particularly young Nathaniel's generation and probably the last 2 generations above him. So I was sort of brought up by my mother to be sort of thrifty, and so I've actually had a pension for a very long time. It doesn't seem that my return.
It started in old money, did it?
It did. Yeah, 4 and 6, governor. So pensions in themselves are very important. So I think that I am very worried that a lot of people are going to get to the age of 65 with no funding at all. They're going to have to work for years and years and years and years. Anyway, so assuming that one has a pension, which is the first start, which of course many of you don't, what are the sort of signs that would make one start thinking about having something more specialist, like a self-invested pension scheme or a self-administered? What would be the trigger points for those?
Good. That's a good question.
I thought so. That's why I asked it.
Yeah, well done, Paul. So I think that the first thing to say, let's try and dismantle a lot of misconceptions around pensions. People assume that a pension is a vehicle that they have to religiously save in for 40 years, and then combined with their state pension, which we talked about last time, so we won't go over that again, they will end up with a pot of money that will provide a lump sum of tax-free cash and then some income. Historically, in previous generations, it was an annuity that was a fixed income for life that would die, unfortunately, if you died. So that wasn't very good value in some cases, particularly those who died very early in life. But pensions, to kind of demystify that, a pension is, to the way I present it to clients, it's just a long-term savings arrangement. And pensions can take many different forms. It can be a personal pension, it can be a property, it can be cash in the bank. But it's just a long-term form of disciplined saving. So I don't want people to think that a pension, we're talking just about pensions per se, that thing that everyone calls a pension. Yeah. A pension is just a long-term savings arrangement. But the answer to your question is that to Nathaniel, to my kids, I started investing for my kids when they were in their mid-teens, because you have the ability to invest up to £3,600 a year, regardless of age and income. So the sooner you start, the longer the money's invested, the more, given compound growth, it will grow. So the earlier you can start, the better. But a lot of people get to sort of 45 and go, oh, I'm still too young. I'll worry about it in a few years. And the reality is that, unfortunately, you have to put an awful lot of money into a pension or some kind of savings arrangement if you leave it to the last 10 or 15 years. The reason why SSASs and SIPPs have become quite popular is the fact that people see the opportunity to take more control of their financial future by investing in things like property and stocks and shares, rather than giving that money to a fund manager in typically an insurance company. So, telltale signs, we talked about lifestyling last time, which is the the de-risking of a portfolio as you get closer to retirement, or those retirement years. So if you think about it, if the last 5 years before your retirement you are de-risking, you've only got a short window, 25 to 30 working years probably, to save up money. And unfortunately, the government, in its wisdom, introduced a cap to pensions, which means that if you go above a certain limit, which is currently 1,073,100, you pay additional tax penalties. So you've got to get a nice balance between pension, the pension wrapper that we've just been talking about, and non-pension assets if you want to retire on a serious income.
And as a businessman that I'm supposed to be, the other thing, of course, about SIPPs and SSASs is it allows people to convert what would be a managed fund into investing in assets which are relevant to their business.
It does indeed.
Yes.
So things like, as I mentioned before, owning the property that your business operates in, for example. Yes. And there's loads of tax advantages of that, which we'll explore. At the moment, it would be fair to say there's a great deal of opportunity in the marketplace. And I mean by investing in stocks and shares, if you are that way inclined.
Why do you think that?
Just because I think that if you look at historical events, wars, key events like political movements, whether it be a EU referendum, whether it be a change of political leadership, when the market takes a bit of a battering, when we've gone through this correction or bear market, as we refer to it sometimes, that's where the greatest opportunities exist. And history has always shown us that. And yes, I have to add the caveat, Paul, that history does not necessarily guide us in terms of the future, so we can't rely on historical events.
I think it does, actually, in the case of this.
But it's a cyclical thing. Property market is cyclical, the stock market is cyclical, interest rates, inflation, all cyclical. And so all of the smart people historically have made more money when everyone else has been selling. That's a fact.
So, listener, ask yourself a question. Are you smart? Or is that a Cold 45? No, that's too many, watching too many Dirty Harry films there, Sandro.
It's the way you swing around in terms of your dialects and accents. I can barely keep up with it.
I can't keep up with myself. You're going to try being inside my brain. Anyway, I think we probably... one thing I was just going to say relevantly, so one of the things I tried to do on the show with Sandro was just... my mind goes off a tangent listening to things you're saying. So one of the things I think is very important is... so only 2 weeks ago, and I've written articles about this, we were staring down the barrel of 25% corporation tax, which I have said publicly is maybe the single worst fiscal decision made in my lifetime, let alone my working lifetime. However, if you ask me the question today, what is the corporation tax rate going to be next year? I would say it might not even be 19%. Sajid Javid has said if he's in, it'll be 15. And of course, Sunak is still playing the sort of I'm the responsible man. I'll give you some tax cuts once I've sort of got the economy under management, hasn't he?
Yeah, I might want to edit that last bit. But I think that's right. And if you look at Rishi Sunak's resignation letter, it was politically beautiful, wasn't it? I mean, talk about creating a CV in a resignation letter. But yeah, I think that we live in a capitalist society, whether we like it or not. And I know there's lots of socialists out there that disagree with this. But, entrepreneurially, it is the businesses of the UK that have fueled the economy for 100 years.
Sausalito. Sausage. I forgot what sausage is in Italian now.
Paul.
I have.
Salsicce.
Salsicce. Oh, how could I forget? Anyway, I've had a really exciting thought while we were listening to those happy songs. So in the next edition of Financial Forte, Sandro and I are going to war. Okay. So he is going to be Richard III and I am going to be Henry VII, and we all know who won, don't we? So we'll even bring in a horse for Sandro to fall off, and I'll let Nathaniel run him through with his sword.
I haven't even got a hump on my back either. I can organise one though.
You will by the time we've finished. So let's just say that Sandro and I don't necessarily agree on who the next Prime Minister should be, so I think that would be quite entertaining.
I think that would be entertaining. It's back to the old school debates that I had when I was about 14 years old. So yeah, looking forward to that, Paul.
Yes, I think one of the things, obviously, that probably most people don't have access to is two people with no agenda. Whatever you think, we don't have an agenda as such. So, you might think that what I'm saying is misguided, but it's genuinely misguided, if you see what I mean. So for those of you who want access to it, I have written Paul's version of how he sees the economy in the latest Aspen Weight magazine. So good read, I think. Yes,
I will make sure I have a read of that.
I've never been one to, not say what I think, so I'm quite happy to be bold. Anyway, so let's go back to the exciting world of pensions, properties, all sorts of things. So
to finish the little bit about sort of dissecting what SIPs and SASs are, SIP is effectively a personal pension, Paul. So and the difference between that and the stereotypical personal pension that we all know about, I guess, particularly since most of us participate in a workplace pension scheme these days, otherwise known as auto-enrolment. It is still a personal pension when all's said and done. The difference is that instead of handing our money to an insurance company, to a fund manager to manage that money for us, we can effectively take control of that asset, and effectively through two separate and distinct parts of the self-invested personal pension, we can manage our own money. Section 1 is what we call the cash account. So you put money in that will pay typically the annual fee for running the self-invested personal pension. And caveat here is that self-invested personal pensions, as I guess we would all imagine, are slightly more expensive to run because of that degree of control that we can have. So for smaller funds, SIPs, self-invested
personal. What do you call a small fund?
Well, generally north of £100,000, you tend to find that it's more cost efficient to have a self-invested personal pension. For smaller sums, so sub 100,000, you find that because a SIP's charges are explicit, and by that we mean a fixed charge, as a percentage of the fund, they are less good value. So, but it varies from provider to provider. So, in the one hand, you've got a cash account. You could, in theory, put all of your contributions into a cash account. That would be a bit daft because inflation and interest rates and so on would quickly eat into that in real terms. And then you've got the investment account, which can hold things like, as we've mentioned before, and we'll explore in detail, property, unit trusts, and other insured arrangements, such as, for example, a trustee investment plan. So that's like going to an insurance company.
You can't invest in yachts and things, can you?
There are lots of prohibited investments, and there are lots of allowed investments. And actually, the answer to the question is you cannot invest in something from which you derive a personal benefit. So, for example, a yacht, a domestic residence, for example. But there are lots of permitted investments. There are some SIP providers that allow you to invest in fine wine collections, for example. There are others that don't. So it varies from SIP provider to SIP provider because they are the trustees of the self-invested personal pension. We'll go on to SASs because the rules are slightly different for those.
So you could put your rental property portfolio into a SIP?
Not domestic rental property. Domestic rental, anything of a domestic nature is prohibited as an investment.
Even if you don't live in it yourself?
Correct.
Okay.
But you can invest in commercial assets such as office blocks.
What do you think? What's the logic behind that?
Don't really know. There was actually talk a few years ago about rental buy-to-let properties when the buy-to-let property market exploded. There was talk about them being allowable investments. Now, let's just take, as you mentioned, Paul, a property portfolio of buy-to-lets that is run as a business. Commercially, there isn't really any logical reason why you wouldn't allow that. Obviously,
but you're telling me but it's not allowed.
It's not allowed under the rules as they stand. It's not allowed. I just can't give you an explanation as to why.
Well, no, I think that's one of the interesting things because obviously, one of the things that I'd like to do in these shows is not just talk to people about, the technical aspects. It's the whys and wherefores and give them some advice or practical. Get people thinking about, how they could restructure what they did. So if you think about it, in terms of if you had any common sense, which of course doesn't seem to go with being a politician, for instance, there's a shortage of property. Bridgewater, for instance, massive shortage of rental property. Rental properties go like in a day, know. So I think creating an incentive for people to want to build up a portfolio of rental properties using their pension would be quite a sensible thing to do. And I can't really see, if you actually look at it intellectually, the difference between that and, buying a warehouse and renting it out to a food company, for instance,
Well, you are talking about logic here, though, Paul. And there's a certain government department who shall not be named that don't display any logic at any time. So, I don't know. It's an interesting conversation to explore, debate, and I will try to find out why that might be. And who knows, in an attempt to try and create more rental property, because we do know that government are actively trying to slow down the building of properties at the moment.
Are they?
Yeah.
Where are they trying to do that?
I don't know, but apparently they're trying to stop the economy overheating, if it isn't already overheated.
They're trying to boost homelessness, possibly.
Maybe. That's a conversation I guess we can have on another day, but it could well be that they, at some point, they do see the merit in allowing rental properties as an asset of a SIP, or indeed a SAS, because we'll talk about those as well. Okay, so what do you want to talk about? So obviously I don't know what you're going to talk about.
I've got lots of things in my mind.
I never know what you're going to talk about.
I've got
you just make this stuff up.
I have a lot of practical experience of working with SIPs and SASs.
Yeah.
So I can give maybe a tax advisor's view on how you might run something, for instance.
Well, let's get into the nitty gritty from a tax perspective, because you'll like this, Paul. So the tax benefits. Why do people take control of their own self-invested personal pensions? Well, let's just go back to that property thing. I mean, one of the things that a lot of my clients are doing are buying these drive-in, Starbucks and Costa coffees. They're really big business. If you can buy a unit or a piece of land and build a drive-through, own it in your SIP, the key benefits from a taxation perspective in terms of having a self-invested personal pension, or indeed a SAS, which we'll talk about, is that, number one, any asset held within your pension fund is free of capital gains tax. So as you know, at the moment, if you go and acquire a property and it's not your main residence and it grows in value and you sell it, you've got capital gains tax to pay. Not so in a personal pension, or indeed a SAS, an occupational pension, because pensions are exempt from capital gains tax. Secondly, any rental income realised by the asset is pumped back into the pension. It's the owner of the asset. And that's a very tax efficient way of reinvesting that money to boost your overall fund, because that's money going back into the SIP. So instead of just having capital growth in the asset, you've got a ready flow of regular income, which effectively is your pension contributions moving forward. And instead of paying tax on the income from the rental property, as if you had owned it yourself, the money is going back into the SIP to boost the cash account, which then allows you in future to buy further assets.
May I ask you a question, please, sir?
You may.
So say you were a 52-year-old business person and you created a SIP or a SAS and you had a commercial property. At what point can you then trigger a pension, if you see what I mean? And what happens?
So,
is there a number of years you have to have it before you can?
So at the moment, the minimum age, as we currently see here today, the minimum age at which you can draw pension benefits is 55 in the UK.
So could you be 52 and just have it for 3 years?
You could.
You could.
Yeah. Now, here's another little caveat to bear in mind, that if your pension asset entirely consists of bricks and mortar, a property, and that's maybe generating rent, then realistically you haven't got a pension fund that's liquid, so you can't then go and draw out £50,000 because there's no cash in the account.
Could you mortgage it?
Yeah, you can, because you can borrow against property within your SIP or your SAS. But typically what you could do is live off the rental income. So if the asset inside the pension fund, think of it as a cash pot, except it's bricks and mortar. If it's generating £3,000 a month of rent, for example, nothing would stop you drawing that money off as a pension income.
Before we get on to the next track, what would you say was a target, percentage yield on your return? So if you bought a property for 500,000, what sort of rent should you really be looking for, would you say?
Well, there's two answers to that question, Paul, which is a good question, actually. Number one, generally speaking, property yields, and by yield we mean income less expenses, so the net yield, the amount that you end up with, typically, if you can get 3.5%, 4%, you're doing pretty well.
Not very good, is it?
It's not, but it's better than cash.
True.
And if you consider the other tax advantages we've just been talking about, if you add it all up, in a tax-free environment or tax-efficient environment, not a bad return. The other aspect to the question you've just asked, which is probably not intended, but I'm going to mention it because it's very important, is that when people end up with a pot of money, going back to that whole retirement plan thing, they say, how much money do I need in my pot, Sandro, in order to realise a sustainable income for the rest of my life? In the old days, we called it an annuity, but we don't want to buy annuities these days because we don't want to lock in our pension and then an income, and then if it dies, the fund dies with us, or if we die, the fund dies with us. So we normally recommend that 4% is what we call a safe withdrawal limit. In other words, it's an amount of money, a yield, that should, in theory, be sustainable forever, so long as your money, your assets, are managed in a fairly modest, middle-of-the-road way.
Truly beautiful Tuesday afternoon off the Days of Future Past album, one of the best albums of all time. Of course, the best track off there that Sandro would know is Nights in White Satin. I expect you've smooched various women in your lifetime to that, haven't you?
I can't possibly comment, Paul.
Yeah, little stallion he is, riding around the Sierra Nevada or whatever. What about Italian cowboys?
Slowly dismantling my reputation here.
Oh no, I was looking at I was looking on your Google thing just there, and I felt I don't know why you ever come and talk to me. I just felt the great Sandro Forte.
Well, I might say the same thing about you, Paul.
Well, no, you might, but it would be more true about you.
I'm humbled in your presence.
Anyway, so we're going back to the world of SASs and SIPs. So, what's the next thing then, Sandro?
Well, we've been talking about acceptable investments within a self-invested personal pension. I should just point out, of course, that these are regulated investments. It's not like a free-for-all where you can do what you like. There are certain rules and regulations, so that's why typically...
What do you mean by that?
Well, because they are regulated pension schemes, they have to conform to certain HMRC rules. Okay. So we're on the subject of HMRC. I mean, clearly anything goes in terms of rules and regulations, but they have to be run in a certain way. So you can't, for example, make personal loans to yourself. You can't go and buy a non-regulated investment. For example, as we were discussing earlier, a yacht, or if the SIP provider doesn't allow it, fine wine collection. So the SIP provider, which is a trustee, is responsible for making sure that you run your scheme in accordance with the rules. And we'd need a whole separate radio show, Paul, to talk about the rules. But broadly speaking, in this particular case, SIPs are kind of easy to run because typically the member doesn't run the pension scheme, isn't responsible for the regulation side of things. It is the SIP provider typically that would be responsible. So as long as we conform to the rules and regulations and we do what's acceptable to the SIP provider, and when it comes to SIPs, make sure you shop around because they all have different rules in terms of what they do and don't allow. The other thing to mention that a SIP can potentially allow you to do is to own 100% of a company's shares as long as the company isn't owned by the member. So you can go and buy shares in a company if you want to, but you can't control those shares if you are the member of the pension scheme. Have I made that clear?
So
I'm not sure.
You can't. So you obviously can't buy more than 50%. Is what you're saying?
So if I owned a SIP and I wanted to invest in Forte Financial shares, I couldn't own shares in Forte Financial because the shares are owned by me. So we'll talk about SASs because SASs have a slightly different set of rules where you can't own more than 5% of the shares in your company.
It's quite an interesting point, this. So let's create a scenario then.
Yeah.
So Paul Waite has his eye on a company which he currently has no involvement in.
Yeah.
So could my pension fund buy that company?
Yes.
All of it?
Well, it can own 100% of the shares in a company, so long as it's not your company, because then you are directly benefiting, I suppose, from the acquisition. But you could go out and acquire another company's shares using your SIP. Yes.
That's very interesting. That's going to prompt a debate with you at some point. That is.
Okay. We'll do that as part of the War of the Roses.
No, because that day I'm going to hate you. You're going to go down. You'll go down into the stinking.
Do you know what? I'm sure
I
will. I will. But
you will fall on. I will ram that sword into you, Fortissimo.
Now, we don't want to go into too much detail on SASs, but the only difference there to mention about SASs is that a SAS can do the same thing. It can invest in shares of a company, including the shares of the company of the principal employer, providing they don't exceed 5% of the value of the SAS. That's the only slight difference between the two things. And then there are loans that can be made as well, borrowing that can be affected using the assets of each respective different type of personal pension or self-administered pension scheme. In other words, you can go out and borrow. Let's say, Paul, that you've got £100,000 in your pension fund. You see a property that you want to buy, commercial property, drive through. It's £150,000. You can use your SIP as collateral to go to a high street bank and say, can you lend me £50,000, which doesn't exceed 50% of the value of the SIP. And therefore, the lender will say, there you go, Paul, there's £50,000. You've now got the £150,000 you need to buy the property. Yes, you've got a debt in the SIP of £50,000, but the rental income will be used to repay that debt over time, much like a mortgage.
So going back to the company thing, does it have to be a qualifying trading company? And does it have to already does it need to have existed, or could it be a new company, for instance?
It can be a new company, so long as you've got a value to the shares. Those shares it's been properly constructed, and it has a value, whatever that value happens to be. Then yes. Remember, if you go out and buy shares in a company that has no value, the person that loses here is you as the member, or as the scheme members in the case of a self-administered scheme. Because remember, a self-administered scheme is not a personal pension, is an occupational scheme that normally has one or more members, typically employees or directors of the company. So, there's lots of things you can do with both. The rules generally are the same for both, more or less. There are just 2 or 3 slight differences between self-invested personal pensions and self-administered pension schemes.
Yeah, so one little contribution from me before we get on to the next track, the wonderful Bambaleo and the Gypsy Kings. They're all strolling around playing their guitars, lots of them, looking very happy. So one of the things I think is very important is, so the old maxim was, you needed a good bank manager, a good lawyer, a good accountant, or whatever, of course, a great financial advisor. I think what is extremely important is to integrate the advice. So financial advice on its own is never as good as, obviously, say you and I working together. And I gave an example earlier. So those business people of you out there, what you can do, for instance, is to use your pension fund monies to buy a commercial property or a new industrial unit that you're going to build yourself that gives you all this, in the case of a client I worked with, a brand new facility and And then what we did was I sat down with the architect and we got a schedule of works, and I went through and identified all of the costs which were allowable for capital allowances, and then I put all of those into his limited company, and then everything else went into the pension fund. Beautiful.
Very good planning, that, Paul.
See, mine P for Paolo and P for professional. You on the other hand, are S for Sandro.
Yeah,
and
don't even
S
say it.
Exactly. I prove my point. Anyway, welcome back, listeners. And here we are with Mr. Paolo Waito, and or as I like to call myself in French, Monsieur Sarete. You think that's a good name?
That is, but where does it come from?
It means Mr. Stop. Well, it's wait, isn't it?
Oh, I'm not. Yeah.
So I either call myself Monsieur Latonde or Monsieur Sarete, which I think is a great improvement on Mr. Wait.
Roger Hargreaves has got 2 new characters for his books there, I think. Do you remember the Mr. Men series?
Oh, well, Mr. Tickle, of course, is my favourite.
Yeah.
So like you say your name is Sandro Forte! Sandro Forte!
There you are, Mr.
So you
Loud.
could be Mr. Exactly, that's what I was saying.
He was
or your name could be Sandro Lente or Sandro... What's quiet? Italian. Not it's got anything to do with pensions, of course.
No.
No. Call yourself a
I don't know. I've had a
Salsiccia.
my brain is all over the place at this because I'm just anticipating what's coming next.
Okay, so we'll go back to something you're happy talking about. So let's talk about some regulated investment, or
I'm not saying I'm happy talking
or
about
a guilt or something. Sandro gets off in the morning. He can't wait until he picks up his pink Financial Times and reads a very dry article.
But you know what? I'm only doing this because people want us to talk about it. It's not because I wake up in the morning and go, do you know what? Can't think of anything I'd rather talk about today than pensions.
Go on then.
So the only thing a couple of things to just mention in relation to SASs, these are the self-administered schemes that are typically for directors and senior employees of companies. As the name would suggest, small numbers of people. There isn't actually a currently limits to number of members, but we normally say up to 11. Don't ask me why. And the only 2 major differences really I think with self-administered schemes is that the SAS can lend money to the sponsoring employer, which is quite good from a cash flow perspective, I guess, from time to time. Mm-hmm. And the major difference is that each member of the SAS is usually a trustee. Now, there's normally an independent pensioner trustee appointed by the SAS, but if you and I were co-directors in a company, Paul, and we were members of our SAS, we would take on trustee responsibilities by definition. So that gives us a layer of responsibility we don't have if we are members of a SIP, where the trustee responsibilities fall on the SIP provider.
So looking at a practical scenario again. So let's imagine now that we're a 65-year-old business person with a portfolio of relevant business assets mostly. Mm-hmm. Would that person normally start to turn those into cash as they get older?
Yes, and that's another good question, actually, because let's say you were 65 and I'm 55.
All right. Yeah, well, you really are asking for it, I'll tell you.
But let's say there was a 10-year difference and you wanted to retire.
Yes.
The way it works in a SAS is that because we don't own our individual pensions like we would do if we had 2 SIPs and we jointly owned a property, we have to sell that asset unless there's a way we can find some cash to give you to buy your pension. Mm-hmm. So there are some drawbacks to having a self-administered scheme, particularly if you're not especially liquid. So, as we've said many times before on this show, what we tend to give with one hand in terms of tax advantages and flexibility, we often end up having to take back with the other and vice versa. And the inland revenue works the same way. So you need to be very cognizant of the fact that if you've got a member that's reaching retirement age and they need to lay their hands on their entitlement to tax-free cash and a pension, there has to be sufficient liquidity in the scheme to prevent the sale of assets in order to provide those benefits.
Okay, so let's make it a simple scenario. So let's imagine that there's effectively one significant fund asset, and the guy is now, we roll on a bit, he's got to 67. Does he then maybe sell the property, and then does the SAS, is it just then a cash fund effectively? And what happens with the cash?
Well, you probably wouldn't do that in practical terms because by doing that you disadvantage the younger members. What you probably do is
I'm just thinking more about if it was just a one person, you know.
Well, if it's one person, and either if the rental income is insufficient to sustain the member in retirement, then you would sell that asset, turn it into cash, and either use the cash to provide the pension, or you then hand that money over to a fund manager who might manage that money for you in the form of what's called a trustee investment account.
So you would then make the cash work for you in a similar way to how a normal person's fund would work, maybe.
Exactly the same. Yeah,
that's really what I was getting at.
Yeah, I mean, there may come a point in the future, Paul, where interest rates and therefore annuity rates rise. There might come a point, I don't think it will be in my lifetime, but there may come a point where annuity rates rise to the extent that people say, I've got a £400,000 fund, annuity rates are 7%, £28,000 a year, guaranteed for the rest of my life, I'll take that. But at the moment, annuities aren't very attractive, so you wouldn't do that.
So what would be a typical annuity rate? 4 or 5?
It varies depending on the age of the individual, obviously, because it's based on mortality. But yeah, you wouldn't get 4 or 5, anything like 4 or 5.
Really?
I mean, closer to between 2 and 3%.
Yuck.
Yeah. So not even, unless you have got no dependents, where you're not really worried about passing on any kind of legacy, maybe where you've got a limiting life illness, for example, where annuity rates then will be enhanced because obviously they're basing the rate on your mortality likelihood. There aren't many reasons why you'd purchase an annuity, but I'm making that as a generic comment. Each individual person will have their own set of circumstances and need to take advice.
So are we able to stray from the field of pensions now into a more exciting field?
Is there a more exciting field in the world of
there is in my
services?
there is in my life, obviously not in yours.
Just one. Yeah,
that's probably why you're a speaker, because you don't really want to be an advisor, I expect.
No.
Yeah. It's all advised out.
On the subject of pensions, though, just to finish, lifetime allowance is worth mentioning again. We talked about it last time, but we still get lots of questions about it because people are very fearful of having to pay this.
You mean the 1,037,000 thing?
1,073,000.
Oh, I'd reverse the 73. Oh.
Sooner or later, 1,073,100, unless of course you've got fixed protection 2014 or fixed protection 2016. We won't even go there, but suffice to say, if you build up a pension fund of 1,073,100, unless you've got fixed protection from earlier years, you can run into very punitive tax penalties.
Give me an idea. You may not know the answer to this, but I expect you do. What sort of percentage of the population would actually have a fund that potentially could be more than 1,073,000, would you say?
Wow, good question, to which I don't know the answer, so you're absolutely right about that. But I would be guessing a very small percentage.
Because I know that mine isn't, for instance.
Single figures. It's going to be single figures.
My pension fund isn't at 1,073,000. Despite the fact, I have to say, why is this, Sandro? You're supposed to be the best advisor.
Because you haven't put enough in it yet.
I put loads in.
But and this goes back to a very serious planning point. You know, if you are building money in a pension pot, you have to ask yourself a question. If I've got to say £1 million,
ask yourself a question, punk.
But if I've got to £1 million, do I carry on funding pensions, knowing that if I take income from a crystallisation, so crystallisation is the realisation of funds in assets in a fund. If I draw more than 1,073,100 in terms of my tax-free cash and then income, do I want to pay a 25% tax surcharge on income and a 55% tax surcharge on tax-free cash? So remember, tax-free cash is exactly as it says on the tin, it's tax-free. The thought of having to pay 55% on tax-free cash as a surcharge because you've exceeded the limit is kind of unthinkable.
Let me ask you a good question. So this is a good question, I think. So imagine now you're in surcharge land. What happens if you would make a seed enterprise investment scheme investment?
I think we've touched on this before.
How does that affect the 55%?
Well, I'd have to defer to you as a very, very highly qualified best of the bunch accountant, Paul.
Yeah.
But let's just follow this through logically. This is not an official answer.
Okay.
But pensions are earned income. They are taxed as earned income.
Yeah.
So they'll be taxed at 0, 20, 40 or 45.
Yeah.
If you made a seed enterprise investment where you get 50% income tax relief, I see no reason logically why you couldn't offset an SEIS investment against income tax.
So again, going back to my point earlier about having integrated advice, which might mean simply more than talking to one person, you might need to talk to, say, you and me, for instance, is is it seems to me that where you're getting into that sort of territory, that there is a solution maybe. So you can talk about, sit down with that person, discuss how they see the future. What is important to them. Is it having cash now? They're not bothered about cash, etc. And then it would be possible, for instance, maybe to devise a strategy where you stopped funding your pension scheme, and maybe you started funding other tax efficient investments. That was my point.
And that goes back to a point I touched on very briefly earlier that you've picked up on, and that is, if you get to £1 million, and I've got plenty of clients who've kind of hit that threshold, it doesn't actually make any tax efficient sense for them to carry on funding their pensions, knowing that if they boost their fund to 1.2, 1.3 million, they're going to lose up to 55% of the surplus. So, what's the point? Look at alternatives potentially.
Welcome back to Financial Forte. It's quite good for me because I actually can pretend to be a member of the wonderful Forte family. Do you know my favourite Forte outlet in the whole of the UK is?
No, very interested to know though.
Forte's ice cream parlour in Burnham-on-Sea.
That's my auntie and uncle, Sheila and Lydia.
Banana splits, Knickerbocker glory. You can even have a mixed grill. Do you know that?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, so for those of you who go on holiday to Burnham-on-Sea and go in Forte's ice cream parlour, bellissimo.
Or buonissimo.
No, it's bellissimo. Buonissimo means very good.
Yeah, but if you're describing food, you'd say buonissimo.
No, okay, so it's very beautiful food. If you
it is
very good
beautiful
food.
and
yes.
beautiful.
Anyway, let's talk about something really exciting.
And we moved on from pensions. Please remove all sharp implements from
Mr.
around
Sleepy
yourself.
here. Moved on from Mr. Tickle.
We've had a few requests, Paul, from people saying, please can you help us make sense of the current marketplace? I'm not sure we can do that in the time we've got left, but we'll do our best. And then a number of questions around mortgages, and I'm getting to the end of my fixed rate. What's happening with interest rates?
Cool.
Do I twist or do I stick? So maybe we can have a little chat about that as well.
We can talk whatever you want because you are the boss.
I don't think that's going to be
only for another 4 weeks.
I was going to say until the next time.
Until you go down.
Yeah, you're already planning all the music you're going to play, the Death March and various other things.
I don't need to do that. I'd just rather gloat.
So the current market, I can't wait. So the current market, difficult to make sense of it. But what I would say is that, and this is my one and only controversial comment of the day, because I don't want this to in any way suggest that any of your wonderful listeners are guilty of this. But what we ended up with, Paul, during COVID was this period of inertia for most people where they weren't working, inverted commas, but they were being paid. We called it furlough. And so they were stockpiling lots of money because they weren't spending anything. And then at the end of lockdown, everyone went completely mad, investing in all the things that they could never afford previously, like holidays to the Maldives and watches and all kinds of...
Is that true?
Absolutely. I mean, this is why people were buying, property at 20% over market value, why there was bun fights in property auctions, why people were paying £300,000 for £50,000 Patek Philippe watches. So you ended up with this massive explosion of expenditure, which fuels the economy, creates an overheating, which pushes inflation up, because inflation is a measure of how we spend money. So we had this kind of bubble that was created by all of us, by all the people out there that were benefiting from government handouts for a couple of years. And now we are paying the price for that because, of course, inflation has skyrocketed to 9%. That then puts inflation then puts pressure on interest rates. And the Bank of England and other monetary committees have to push interest rates up to get spending down. And so what you then end up with is a situation where people, much like we had in 2009, people say, I can't afford to pay my mortgage. I can't afford all. And then they start to batten down the hatches, tighten their belts. And so that cyclical market that we talked about earlier starts all over again. And we're going to see a reduction eventually in inflation. That's inevitable. But if you then overlay, but not before we felt some pain, if you then overlay energy prices, the small matter of a war in Ukraine, which causes uncertainty, and no market likes uncertainty, all the political instability in the UK at the moment, that's a fairly potent mix for all kinds of economic issues. As a consequence, what we then have to look at as investors, because whether it's a pension or an ISA or any other kind of investment, what we then have to look at is how do we make money that is in excess of inflation, because as we know, and we've talked about this on the show before, Paul, if I've got £100 and inflation is 9%, I'm losing £9 of that £100 in real buying terms. I was talking to my mum a couple of days ago, and she was reading off a list of all the prices of things when I was born in 1968. And we were talking about, a packet of cigarettes being 15p and the average income being £3,000 and the average house price being £15,000 and all these other interesting statistics. But look at the average house price now, £300,000 plus. So what we know about inflation is that the cost of things rises over time. Yeah. And in order to make real money, and I'm not just talking about having £100 in the bank at the start and end of the year, because if you don't keep pace with inflation, the buying power of your assets goes down. So how do you make 9% at the moment? Well, the reality is, unless you take lots of risk, you don't. You just have to be prepared to take the long game to try and get 7 to 8% return if you can. And inflation will average itself over a period of time. I think the average rate of inflation since the Second World War has been about 3.5% to 4%. So if we can make 3.5% to 4% plus any income we want to take, we are always going to sustain capital in actual terms and in buying power terms.
Just an interesting aside, just to see whether you are a man of the people or a man of the bourgeoisie or whatever you are, the nouveau riche. When you go to fill your car up now, is your attitude towards that the same as it would have been a year ago?
Yeah, it is. For me personally, I think probably because I'm a bit more sanguine and philosophical, and my awareness of what causes these short-term market conditions, it's a price I'm paying for my own indulgence, and I'm using that as a general comment. So I'm probably a bit more philosophical about it. Yes, it still hurts. It doesn't fill me with a great deal of delight to spend £160 filling my car up, whereas a year and a half ago it cost me £90 to fill it up.
So here we are. So we're again defining the battle lines for our next great common conflict. So I, being more a person of the people, maybe.
Yeah. You've got an electric car.
No, I have to say. So the answer is so my spending pattern is vastly different. So I actually now put £59 in my car, for instance,
because that's what you used to put in.
Yeah. I just think I don't want to put in £100. It just depresses me, so I put £59 in.
Okay. So the question was, do I feel the same? I do, but I'm not prepared to. My approach to things is different in the sense that I don't drive to see as many clients. So I'm not spending more money. It's costing me more to fill up my tank. I'm just doing less traveling. So I'm still cutting my cloth, but in a different way. Because I can't afford in my business to not see anybody. Can't do it all via Zoom, for example. I just have to pick and choose a bit more. Yes. So I'm still controlling my expenditure, which is sensible, of course. It doesn't mean to say filling up my tank is any less painful. I reverse engineered the process, I think is what I'm trying to say.
I think it's very difficult to see any end to energy costs and say the war even. And then, of course, if we want to be, really depressing, you've got probably, 3 months for the next Prime Minister to be determined. Maybe, I'd say as a betting man, almost certain Labour government next election, probably. None of these things are particularly good, are they? I'm not saying, so let's qualify what I mean by this. None of the things are very particularly good for investor confidence or the markets, inflation coming under control. But one of the things that one of my old bosses used to say to me was that Labour governments were very good if you were a professional, because people wanted your services more, which is something I take some comfort in.
Going back to the very, very first show we did together, I came up with a list of 10 rules, and if you haven't listened to the 10 rules, it might be worth a quick recap. But rule number 1 was don't make emotional decisions, and it's what people do all the time. It's logical, it's natural, it's part of human nature to make decisions based on what we see in front of us. High inflation, high interest rates, the stock market having fallen quite dramatically over the last sort of 7-8 months. Why on earth would you want to invest in the stock market right now? Why not fix your interest rate? Why not do? There's lots of logical reasons why people would do stuff. But there's lots of emotional reasons why people do stuff too, and we need to make sure that we're in the right camp.
So, one must not be a daydream believer. We have 2 great tracks from the Monkees, of whom I am one.
Ooh.
7A.
What number is this, Chip?
7A.
Okay, no, I mean, like, don't get excited, man. It's because I'm short, I know.
Oh, I could hide neath the wings of the bluebird as she sings. The 6 o'clock alarm would never ring.
Going down. Yeah, that's what we're going to play. You know the Executioner song? Going down. Around the world today. That's going to be the first song we're going to play. Then I'm going to introduce Sandro.
You have to give me your email address before I go.
After I smashed
a playlist.
Smashed him one across the chops.
We'll take it in turns. We'll choose a playlist and we'll take care of alternate songs.
Without being too thick, Nathaniel, it says, what was it, gap 11 minutes and 8 to 14 minutes 59. What does that mean? I've never seen that before. Look, gap 2.
Oh, so that's just to the hour. So that's just when it will end.
So how many minutes is it to the end then?
11 minutes. So just that bit is the end.
So is that 11 minutes including the songs?
No, that's 11 minutes of just talking.
Oh, 11 minutes of talking?
Yes.
Right, okay. All you people in listener land have to become believers of the Forte experience. Coming to you soon in an outlet. Worldwide, global, Dubai, America. But it all makes the same to Sandro, because he owns houses in just about every country in the world. As he has won awards in nearly every country in the world, haven't you?
Well, the last bit's true. I'm very pleased to say. Yeah, I'm very humbled by that. I was just actually about to say to Nathaniel, he needs to make sure that we up Paul's dosage in whatever it is he's taking.
Thank you. That's very kind. Right, we have 11 minutes of talking, Mr. Sandro, before we end today's financial Forte.
Well, let's...
what shall we talk about?
Well, I'm interested in your view, actually, of the current state of the world in which we live.
You know that you'll end up with a nervous breakdown if you ask me anything.
You've always got a comment or two. Mm-hmm. Inevitably, Paul, we get asked lots and lots and lots of questions about the current marketplace, and what I say to people is that, and this does defy every emotional reaction that you get from anybody, which is seeing the current marketplace as an opportunity. Do I think the market will go down anymore? I don't know. Do I think it will go up? Probably more likely than it will go down, just because it looks like, if you, by every measure, looks like we've hit somewhere near the bottom of the current cycle. But if I'm out by 10, 20%, what I do know is that people who invest now, when they don't emotionally feel that they want to, those are the people, those are the brave that stick their neck above the parapet that make the most money. And history has always shown that to be true. I bought a whole bunch of shares in April 2020 when the travel market was decimated, if you remember. And companies like Carnival and EasyJet and Jet2, these were stocks that had been decimated by lockdown. And so I did what no one else was prepared to do, or very few other people were prepared to do, and went out and bought a bunch of them, because they were being offered at a discount at that particular time.
I would not buy shares in Jet2.
Well, all I can say is I made 119% profit in 11 months. And then what happens is, even for the experienced amongst us, we kind of go, oh, well, looks like the market's going to carry on going up, so I'll just hang on and make more than 119%. But then what's happened subsequently is that we've been through this recent turmoil, and all of those shares have come off quite dramatically. So my overall profit over the 2-year period is now a lot less than 119%. The point I'm trying to make here is that it's about time in the market. If you buy something at the right price and you're happy with the price you pay, stick with it. That's a really, really, it's a fundamental bit of advice, but it will always stand the test of time.
Wise words, stand the test of time.
Why wouldn't you buy Jet2?
Well, when I was in Kefalonia,
because you've flown with them
3 weeks ago, Jet2 had a flight back that was delayed by 8 hours, for instance.
Okay.
I just think that.
So that's an emotionally driven decision, other than
no, it's a fact that I think that's a very serious issue. I don't really know what the answer is. At the moment, the airlines and airports are failing to deliver an acceptable level of service, and I don't think if it was a train, for instance, that people would So I think something has to happen. It's not acceptable. So I, for instance, was 1 hour late onto a plane which had no bags on it. The pilot himself was having to put bags on, whatever, So anyway. So you said you were interested in my view on what, though?
Just on the current state of the market, because everyone, I'm sure clients come to you, Paul, in terms of what you do to assist them and ask similar questions. And I'm just interested to know where you see
I've got a good one for you. So we might do it. So this is actually a real scenario that was put to me yesterday by a client. Okay. So a client owns a building, right, in Somerset that is used in his business, which has multiple outlets.
Yeah.
The person always claims to be risk averse. He's the most funny risk averse person I've ever met, because he's actually, I have great respect for him. He's like, he's like one of those people that's like, I don't know what I'm doing, and then he goes and buys another company, and he's one of those type of people.
Yeah.
So let's try it. So this person bought a property for 100 units, which is used for one of their town locations, and a landlord in the town has approached him and says, "I'll basically buy the site. There's 100 units that cost you 100 units for 130 units." My client's actually quite interested in this, right? But then, for instance, I'm trying to see if I get the numbers right in my head. So he's quite keen on taking up this offer, which then gives him 130, right? And then his rationale is that gives him cash, and he can then finish some of his loans and stuff like that, de-risk himself. Okay. Then we get the interesting bit. So he then says that the landlord, the new landlord, if he sells it to him, will lease back the property to him. And let's just say, using my example of, if I get my maths right, the rent would be 8.
Yeah.
Okay. So within 4 years, the rent over about 3.7 years, I worked it out. He's actually eroded all the profit he made from selling it. Right.
Yeah.
So what would your advice be on that?
That's an interesting one, because I'll share transparently the way my business model works. For example, is that my business has grown to a size where it has a capital value, and that capital value is determined within my industry. It's not a figure I put on my business. It's a generally accepted way of calculating the value of my business. So the question I have for myself, at one point in the future, I'm going to be looking at, inverted commas, retiring, even though I never see that physically happening. But let's say I want to take a step back, or spend less time, running around in the fast lane like I do at the moment. The question to ask myself is, do I want to take the lump sum and pay the tax on it, or do I want to carry on deriving the income that I generate from the business? And the simple maths here is that on a multiple, let's say, of 6, I'm better off taking the income in perpetuity than I am to take a lump sum that's only equal to 6 times annual revenue, obviously. Because even if I invest that money, I can't derive an income of 15% to make up for the fact that I've got this ongoing income. So I think the simple answer to that one would be, using that example for me personally, is why would you want to give up the regular income being generated by your businesses for a lump sum? That's part one. But to your specific question doesn't sound like a very good deal, does it, for him?
Yes, because that's what I said. So I said no. I said niet. My advice to you. So actually, what I said, just to be complete, as I said, there's 3 scenarios. Right? You want to get out. You think you're going to grow. Blah blah blah. All right. So you need to ask yourself, what is it? What is it you're actually trying to do? Because my answer would depend on which of each of the scenarios. So if the guy said he was totally looking to de-risk. Now, of course, in this scenario, the group is going to continue with multiple outlets. I suspect no individual, he will continue to grow. So to me, selling a building to create a short-term 30% gain, which will be eroded by the rent in 4 years. When you think about what would happen if he carried, it's just, to me, it was nonsense. So to me, it was quite an easy no, not attractive.
Well, a couple of things we talked about during the links poll, as you know, is exactly this subject. This is why advice is so important, whether it's from a good financial advisor or a good accountant, because everybody's circumstances are different. If you're looking to de-risk, let's say, or if you're looking to wipe out your inheritance tax liability, let's say those properties were owned in his own name, there's two great reasons why he would want to sell. On the other hand, if they were owned within a company and there were shares issued in that company, or inheritance tax wasn't an issue for him, and there's lots of different scenarios that lead to lots of different potential outcomes. So I think you're absolutely right the way you summarise that, which is it depends. And I know that's a very vague answer to give people, but one size definitely doesn't fit all.
Something I'm renowned. So there's a particular client. I get fined now £1 for every time I say depends, because it's my answer to everything. People ask me questions all the time, and my stock answer is, well, it depends. Because I in my experience, when you're asked an advisory type question, it's very rare you can actually say black, white. It's this. Usually it is. It depends. Mm-hmm. So if you were to do this, blah, 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 and if you were to do this, my advice would be that. Yeah. So I mean, depends.
Well, let's not get you and I in a room with one of our clients then, because I'd say exactly the same thing. Because you're absolutely right, though. You have to fully understand somebody's circumstances, needs and objectives before you can give proper advice. So
what do you want to talk about mortgages?
I don't want to talk about mortgages. People just ask me to talk about them.
You do!
Lots and lots of people recently have said, right, I'm in November, I've received a letter from my lender, you're coming up to the end of your current rate, do you want to just revert to the standard variable, or do you want to fix your rate? Again, this is a generic comment. I can't give specific advice, so there's that caveat. But generally speaking, interest rates ain't going down anytime soon. Therefore, with some still actually quite attractive fixed rates still available, you might want to think about fixing a rate for 2, 3, 5 years in order to lock in that rate and manage your finances moving forward. Because if you just leave it to the vagaries of standard variable rates, which are typically 2% higher than fixed rates, you're going to be paying an awful lot more in a year or two's time.
I think interest rates will hit 3%.
I don't disagree.
In about 2 years' time.
Don't disagree. They're going up, that's for sure. So fixing a rate might be sensible. The only caveat to that is if you're thinking about repaying more than 10%, typically of your mortgage, because a lot of lenders won't allow you to pay more than 10% off at any one time without a penalty, or if you are getting to a point in your life where you're thinking about repaying the rest of your mortgage, then you probably want to think about a variable rate. But otherwise, fix it.
You know it makes sense. So that was remind me what your second name is, Sandro
Forte.
No, you've not got another name.
Alessandro Marco.
Of course it is. Alessandro Marco Forte. I thank you very much as always. And I am just Paolo Davide Waito. Thank you to Nathaniel for producing the show today. Playing out today with Man, I Feel Like a Woman, which is sometimes the case.
Listen in, ding-a-ling-a-lo, to our radio show, Financial Forte. Financial Forte.